Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christopher Roach. I am adjunct professor of architecture here at CCA and co-coordinator of the Urban Lab, along with my colleague Niraj Bhatia. First, I want to thank David Gisson for inviting me to introduce tonight's speaker. It's a real special pleasure for me to be able to introduce Neil Brenner to you tonight, not only because his work is so important to the research conducted in our urban studios and seminars and the agenda of CCA's own urban lab, but also because he played a key role in my own development, I think, as an urbanist and academic. I first met Neil when I was a student at the GSD, where he was invited to be a guest critic for Hashem Sarkis's New Geographies seminar, which I was a TA at the time. And though I'd been introduced to his writing in that course and other places, I had yet to meet a kind of critical urban theorist whose work was so clearly focused on the kind of theoretical and conceptual and methodological kind of issues that we were starting to try to grapple with in our own seminars and studios. And so it was really great to have him. And at the time, he was professor of sociology and metropolitan studies at New York University. And we were lucky to have him back at the GSD later that year as a critic for my own thesis review. And I still recall a really intense conversation that we kind of continued after the review over wine and cheese at the reception. And somehow, after nights of no sleep, I managed to stay awake. So that's a testament to a really good conversation. So little did I know at the time that Neil was being courted by Moisen and probably Hashem and others, and is now professor of urban theory at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, a position he's held there since 2011. In addition to his previous position at NYU, Neil holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, an MA in geography from UCLA, and a BA in philosophy, summa cum laude, from Yale College. At the GSD, Neil teaches classes on critical urban theory, urban political economy, and social-spatial theory, and works closely with architects, landscape architects, planners, and cartographers to develop new approaches to understanding, representing, and influencing contemporary urban transformations. His most recent book, Implosions, Explosions, to be released in 2014, will build upon Henri Lefebvre's ideas to elaborate the methodological foundations for investigating a 21st century forms of global urbanization. Other books of Neil's include New State Spaces, a seminal study on urban governance and state spatial restructuring in Europe during the second half of the 20th century, and several volumes on the need for a critical approach to the urban question in the age of neoliberal capitalism, including Cities for People, Not for Profit, Critical Urban Theory, The Right to the City, co-edited with Margaret Meyer and Peter Marcuse, and Spaces of Neoliberalism, co-edited with Nick Theodore. Neil is also the coordinator of the newly founded Urban Theory Lab at the GSD, a research collective that uses the tools of critical urban theory, historical geopolitical economies, and radical cartography to decipher emergent patterns of urbanization, dispossession, and a struggle over 20th century capitalism. The lab's current work explores a number of research projects through the lens of planetary urbanization, which is a critique of dominant ideologies of the contemporary urban age and associated discourses on global urbanism. I'm sure Neil will be speaking a bit more about that tonight. Some of these projects include theoretical work and exploration of urbanization in extreme territories, in the Earth's most remote places such as the Arctic, the Amazon, the Sahara Desert, the Himalayas, and the Gobi Steppe, as well as the oceans and the atmosphere. Neil's also currently collaborating with Christian Schmidt of the ETH Zurich on a book project entitled Planetary Urbanization. While I could go on to list more of Neil's writing and teaching accomplishments, in order to keep this brief, I'll stop there. However, in case you're not already impressed, I want to end by mentioning that Neil is not merely a formidable academic, but also an accomplished triathlete, marathon runner, and Ironman runner. And I'm happy to see he still has a healthy head of hair, which helps dispel the myth that all urbanists go bald. So please help me in welcoming Neil.
not a Mac user, so can I do this? Yes, sure I can. Awesome. Yep. Great. Chris, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I don't know about how things are here, but for me, it's kind of a crazy time of the semester. It's the end of a long semester. So I'm particularly grateful to folks for coming out tonight when I know that it's really, really busy. So thank you for that. Chris mentioned some of the stuff that I'm doing with my friends and colleagues in the Urban Theory Lab. And that's actually what I want to talk about here, is the idea of the Urban Theory Lab and some of the work that we're doing right now. The notion of an Urban Theory Lab might sound contradictory, because usually the idea of a lab is like it's a group that's oriented towards, it's a collective or some kind of research group that's oriented towards very empirical research. You test hypotheses and you develop kind of concrete interpretations of processes in the world. And the idea of an urban theory lab is kind of at odds with that, because it's a lab about theory. And the sort of the presupposition of this project, which I started with some doctoral students at NYU and then we continued at the GSD, is that theory really matters fundamentally to how we think about the questions that we're trying to study and for how we engage with practices and processes in the world. So particularly in the world of kind of urban questions and urban theory, theoretical assumptions have massive implications for how we study what we study, the very questions that we pose, and also for strategies of intervention. And the idea behind the Urban Theory Lab, which is what I want to try to develop here, is that actually in engaging with urban questions, both in, sorry, is this on? It's not on. Is this better?
No, get it.
Testing. Whoa. Should I rewind entirely and start over again?
You might not need it.
I might not need it at all. Well, I think they need it in order to record. How do we want to do this? Just use the mic. Use this. Whoa. All right. One or the other. Is this working? Yes. Okay. So the premise behind the Urban Theory Lab is that our theoretical assumptions for how we think about urban questions and how we engage with urban questions in the world of design are extremely problematic. They're derived from earlier formations of urbanization, earlier formations of capitalism. We're undergoing rapid transformations in the world. We need to update our theoretical models and our cartographic models in order to deal with these changes. So the idea behind the lab is to create a kind of collective research infrastructure in which we interrogate some of the inherited assumptions about spatial organization, particularly in relation to the city and the urban, and then try to develop alternative ways of thinking about cities and urbanization processes that might be more adequate to contemporary conditions. So specifically to focus on that theoretical or conceptual moment as a way to open up new horizons for both research, theory, and practice. So the idea is that you actually need to focus on that. You need to focus on that theoretical, conceptual, and cartographic moment in order to develop new horizons both for research and for practice. So that's kind of what I want to report on here around the idea of urban theory without an outside, which is the way in which I'm increasingly thinking about urbanization processes and the possibility of design within a world of, as we call it, planetary urbanization. So I'll open this up by just putting up the book cover for the book that Chris mentioned, Implosions, Explosions. It's kind of maybe a weird book cover for a book that's about urbanization. It might kind of go at odds with our assumptions about what urbanization is actually supposed to correspond to in terms of conditions in the world. Presumably people recognize this photograph. Does anybody know what it is? Anybody want to shout out what it is? It's the tar sands in northern Alberta. It's a photograph by a photojournalist named Garth Lenz. And the argument that I'm going to be developing in this lecture, it'll take me a little while to develop it, but the argument is basically that this particular condition of basically massive, large-scale ecological destruction in a relatively remote place. I mean, there is a city, a very rapidly developing city near the tar sands, Fort McMurray, but it's relatively remote. compared to the sort of notions of cityness or urbanization that we kind of carry around with us in everyday life. But I want to argue that this particular condition of the tar sands is as iconic to the contemporary urban condition as the kinds of images that we would normally see in books or presentations on the urban of large skyscrapers and kind of dense urban environments. So the idea behind this exercise as a theoretical intervention is to like radically expand our imagination of what urbanization processes are, and that in turn, I hope, will open up some interesting questions for us about the possibilities for design and intervention in relation to this kind of emergent condition. So the starting point, again, for this kind of whole project of setting up an urban theory lab, the work that I'm doing with Christian Schmidt in Zurich, the work I'm doing with my students and colleagues at the GSD is just this basic idea which Ananya Roy, colleague at Berkeley, recently elaborated, which is that we need new theoretical geographies. Existing geographical assumptions about the world are increasingly derived from a formation of urbanism, urbanization, capitalism that we've superseded, and we need to reinvent our theoretical geographies, and doing so opens up interesting new horizons. So in order to frame this kind of question, I actually want to go back to the work of Manuel Castells, who's pretty interesting radical urban theorist from the 1970s. He's still obviously an active scholar in relation to contemporary debates about globalization. But he framed the urban question in a pretty paradigmatic way that actually I want to break from. So he kind of frames that question in a paradigmatic way that is extremely informative in terms of thinking about the question of new theoretical geographies. So for Castells, and he was not alone in this, in some ways his formulation embodies the assumptions of really the entire tradition of urban theory that we inherit from the 19th century. The basic question of the urban for Castells, as well as for many, many other strands of urban theory, is the question of whether there are urban units. And the basic assumption is that the urban is a particular type of place or type of space which is distinct in some way that has to be specified, and that's what most of the debate is about, from other non-urban spaces. So the search to define the urban as a unit, as a settlement space, is constitutive for the entire epistemological operations of urban social science, and in some ways urban design, urban planning, for the last century, if not longer. So let me just illustrate that proposition. That's a pretty abstract claim, but let me just give you a sense of what I have in mind. Where I'm going with this is that in defining the urban as a type of unit, as a settlement space, there is always a reference, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, to the non-urban as a kind of outside parameter to that urban unit. So every time that anyone in all these different traditions of urban theory tries to specify the urban as a unit, there's a necessary reference to the non-urban that defines the kind of contours, the boundaries, both conceptual and spatially, of the urban itself. So it's often unreflexively presupposed, sometimes more reflexively presupposed, but this dualism between the urban and the non-urban is constitutive, I would argue, for the entire field of urban theory, with a few important exceptions that I'll talk about tonight. So whether in a sociological tradition, in economic tradition, or a geographical or morphological tradition, there are different ways in which the urban is specified as a unit, as a social unit, as an economic unit, as a spatial unit. And every single such attempt, whether to define it sociologically, economically, or morphologically, always involves an implicit or sometimes explicit reference to the non-urban as a social, economic, or morphological space. So now let me just illustrate this in terms of some visualizations. So this is a familiar diagram to any social scientist in the room. It's a famous diagram in social science. It's from Ernest Burgess of the Chicago School, 1920s, sometimes referred to by Mike Davis and others as the Burgess dartboard. And it's a famous representation of Chicago, but also, as he says, more generally, the city, as a place trying to make sense of the human ecology of settlement, the sort of sorting processes among different populations within the city. What's interesting about this spatialization of the urban from my point of view is that the urban is basically everything inside the dartboard. So it's a model of the growth of the city. So, hang on. Okay. It's a model of the growth of the city, so the concentric rings are actually processes of growth that are moving outwards. But the assumption within the Burgess model is that the urban is everything that's contained within the concentric rings. And the non-urban basically begins at the outermost ring, and it's just sort of it's irrelevant, effectively, to the problematique of urban theory. The problematique of urban theory is to draw a boundary around a particular site and then study the sorting processes and growth processes that occur within the site. So this is 1920s. Fast forward to the 1960s. This is the famous model of megalopolis, which may be familiar to many in this room, from Jean Gottman. And it's a completely different scaling of the urban. So the urban is now not so much a place, but a territory, a relatively large-scale territory that extends, as he says, he calls it Boss Wash. It extends from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C., and it's a huge zone. And this was an incredibly radical, and I think still quite relevant exercise for thinking about urbanization processes to sort of upscale it to a very, very large territory. But here, too, despite the very different kind of ontology and cartography of the urban that Gottman is presupposing, there's still this kind of ontology of the urban and the non-urban. And the non-urban is a kind of constitutive outside. So here the non-urban is just this empty space that's outside of the territory of megalopolis. So the boundaries have expanded. I mean, obviously you could fit many, many of Burgess's little dartboards inside of this giant megalopolis, but you still have this constitutive assumption of the urban and the non-urban within a completely different, both conceptually and cartography, a completely different scheme. So what do we make of that? And again, part of my move that I'm trying to make here is to, instead of just focusing on the difference between, say, Burgess and Gottman's conceptions of the urban, which is pretty interesting, actually. There's a lot to be said about that. Let's actually start looking at this non-urban outside and ask ourselves, what exactly is that in this framework? Let me give another example, which may be familiar to you folks, which is, this is a framework that was really important to me, particularly when I was in grad school and then writing my dissertation in my first book. And this is, of course, the model of global cities and global interurban networks that was developed. This one is by John Friedman, this particular visualization, but it's been further popularized by Saskia Sassen and others. And again, it's a completely different, in some ways, a completely different spatialization of the urban from either the Burgess tradition or the Gottman. So the urban is not really a place, and it's not really a territory, it's a node. So what you have here are a bunch of nodes within larger global networks. So the urban becomes a node within a global network, but here too, again, we could spend a long time describing the different arguments that underpin the Friedman or Sassen model of the urban as a node of transnational capital investment and command and control relative to the Gottman model of megalopolis or the Burgess model of human ecology. But I want to underscore here an underlying continuity, which is that here too the non-urban is basically a blank outside. It's sort of an empty space. The problematique of the urban is now the nodes and the networks. And the non-urban is, whether environmentally, ecologically, socially, economically, etc., it's simply outside the realm of what urban theory is supposed to wrestle with. So I want to, again, direct our attention to this zone, this realm of conceptualization, of visualization, and possibly of intervention that's effectively relegated to the outside of this tradition. And let me give one more example, or actually two more examples. This is from Edward Soja's periodization of capitalist urbanization. And Edward Soja is one among many esteemed scholars who uses this kind of a framework to periodize the evolution of urban systems under modern capitalism, particularly in the Marxian tradition, but not only in that tradition, which I think is incredibly informative in so many ways. But the aspect that I want to draw attention to here is that the periodization of urbanization is basically focused on a generic model of the city that forms within successive phases of capitalist development. So you have a mercantile city, the competitive industrial city, the corporate monopoly city, the state-managed or Fordist city. David Harvey famously uses a similar model, the mercantile, the industrial, the Fordist Keynesian, and then he speaks more recently of the post-Keynesian or neoliberal city. I've written about the neoliberal city myself, so in a certain way I'm also engaging in a self-critique. The point I want to make here is not that this periodization doesn't make sense. I think it actually does make sense. It does make sense to embed the evolution of urban form in relation to systemic cycles of capital accumulation. But the interesting thing about this analytical and cartographic strategy is that it focuses on a kind of generic model of cityness, which is then derived from a broader framework of capitalist development or a spatial division of labor. And it basically replicates within a kind of radical political economy framework this assumption or this division between the urban and the non-urban. So the non-urban is still kind of presupposed as this realm outside of this densified zone of cityness. So the same divide between the urban and the non-urban, or the same assumption of the non-urban as a constitutive outside for any delineation of the urban, is presupposed within this kind of radical framework. And let me give one other example, which is actually in sociological and demographic definitions of the urban. I don't know if this particular formula will be familiar to anyone, but this is arguably the most famous definition of urbanization in the 20th century. It comes from a very interesting demographer named Kingsley Davis, who was writing in the 1940s. He developed this formula in the 1940s and continued to use it in his research up through the 1970s. And basically, the assumption is that urbanization is a demographic transformation, and it basically is expressed by the ratio of the total population living within cities to the total national population. And the useful thing about this definition is that you could easily collect data and quantify it. And Davis was actually, according to my work with Christian Schmidt, the first person to attempt to develop a global data set on urban population levels. So, and his same method, in many ways, is still used by the United Nations today in its declarations that we live in an urban world because more than 50% of the world's population supposedly lives within cities. The question, both for Kingsley Davis as well as for the United Nations, in using this kind of framework, is what do you mean by city? What do you mean? Kingsley Davis had a very pragmatic answer to that question. He used the notion of an urban population threshold. He didn't want to get into an abstract theoretical debate, which is what I want to get into today, but Davis didn't want to get into that. And he just said, well, look, let's lock it in at 20,000 and 100,000, and let's see what kind of data we can collect in every country in the world. And he went and spent 2.5 decades doing that and produced some pretty interesting results, actually. But we have to ask the question, what is the specificity of a place that has 21,000 as opposed to 19,000? Is there a qualitative difference? What is the specificity of a place that has 101,000 instead of 99,000? Is there a qualitative difference such that your coding of that data is completely different? It's rural if it's 99,000, it's urban if it's 101,000. So Davis didn't want to get into that. He was trying to develop a very large, complex data system. But it seems to me we have to ask that question. If we're going to talk about urbanization, can we still define it in terms of a specific settlement type, in Davis's model, the population living within cities, as opposed to some other settlement type? And this assumption, this framework, this method for defining urbanization continues. It's not just kind of old 1950s demography. It continues to fundamentally inform contemporary discourse about the urban condition. This is from Rem Koolhaas's book, and he's just quoting UN data that in around 2000, around 50% of the world's population lives within cities. My friends and colleagues at the LSE use the same kind of reference point in their urban age project to sort of highlight the point that more than 50% of the world's population lives within cities. Pretty much on a daily basis, I don't know how it is for you, but I encounter some blog or some paper or some dissertation proposal or some Master of Design Studies proposal, be careful, that uses this notion as a way to justify the particular emphasis on cities. So actually, I want to argue that this is a pretty nonsensical proposition. Unless we can unpack, there are a lot of empirical problems, by the way, with this proposition, because in the UN's data, the national census bureaus that collect urban population data use completely different indicators from country to country. So there's no uniform criterion for the urban from National Census Bureau to National Census Bureau. Just for example, India classifies not only a population threshold, and there's a bit of a population density threshold, but it continues to use a threshold of male non-agricultural employment, which leads most of the Ganges Plain, which I'll talk about a little later on, an incredibly densely urbanized area, to be classified as rural, which is completely nonsensical. If it were to change its categories, the urban population of India would massively escalate, and if the urban population of India massively escalates, the urban population of the world massively escalates. The same thing could be said about China. China continually changes its official census designations for the urban, and that changes China's urban population just through statistical fiat, which in turn changes the world's urban population level. So there's a whole statistical empirical issue here, but theoretically, the problem is still that this whole framework of defining the world in terms of the number of population who are living in an urban condition versus a non-urban condition, it requires us, if we're going to use that kind of a discourse, to define the specificity of what that particular space, what that particular site is, and more often than not, that's not done. So it's another example. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is, in some ways, a more everyday example in the realm of ideology of the same move that I've just tried to track through different traditions of urban theory, from Burgess and Gottman to world city theory to radical kind of Marxist critiques of urbanization. The same underlying ontological divide between the urban and the non-urban is presupposed in this, in some ways, very pervasive, naturalized way of talking about the contemporary urban condition, which I think is pretty misleading. So this is actually from the World Urbanization Prospects from just last year from the UN, and it's just to show you, I'm not making this up, the UN is still using this basic cartography of settlement space, classifying all space as either urban or rural according to different world regions, and it's a kind of percentage indication. So against the background of this kind of somewhat oppositional critical stance in relation to a long history, a lot more could be said, indeed, about this history of urban theory and the way that the divide between the urban and the non-urban has been constructed. It's actually a very interesting lens, which we're using in a number of our inquiries in my lab. It's a pretty interesting lens for reinterpreting and reappropriating a lot of traditions of urban theory that have been neglected or forgotten, from central place theory to the work of someone like Doxiadis, and many other traditions. So there's a whole set of issues that could be raised about the history of urban theory in the 20th century using this kind of lens, looking not at how they define the urban, but the way in which they try to fix the boundary. But the kind of forward-looking question that I want to pose here as a way to develop my own approach is where do the boundaries actually begin, and where exactly do they end, and how do we theoretically delineate those boundaries? And we can obviously have a long debate using different techniques, geospatial techniques, other kinds of empirical techniques for trying to delineate the boundary. But the claim I would make is that any such approach cannot be solved through purely technical means. So no matter how sophisticated your data, your map, the problem is ultimately a theoretical one. Every technical solution to the problem of redrawing the boundaries presupposes an underlying epistemological or cartographic assumption about what the urban is. And so I'm arguing and this is obviously not a surprise given what I said about the Urban Theory Lab, let's talk about those theoretical assumptions. Let's interrogate them systematically. Unless we're clear about that, and it's not easy to get clear about it, but unless we're clear about it, these exercises are basically kind of drifts into the concrete without a kind of theoretical anchor. We need a theoretical anchor if we're going to talk about the urban at all. So there are many different ways of dealing with this dilemma. One of the things that's very interesting about the world of urban theory right now is that a number of folks are confronting this particular question. In other words, going back to what Castell has called the urban question, la question urbaine, and grappling with it explicitly and directly. And there's a lot of disagreement, I think very productive disagreement, about how to wrestle with this question. But that's something that I think is really interesting, is that we're kind of dealing with that collectively. So my particular way into the question of the urban is actually to just completely throw out, and this is maybe too radical a move, or a move that some of my friends and colleagues in this field wouldn't want to make, but I'm ready to kind of take this radical move and see where it leads me. Basically throw out entirely the notion of the urban as a unit, the urban as a settlement space. Just put it aside completely and embrace a resolutely process-based understanding of the urban. So for me, and for my co-author Christian Schmidt, and for many of my colleagues in the Urban Theory Lab, the urban is not a unit. It's not a type of space that we contrast to other spaces. It is a process. It's a process of transformation that's unfolding in different sites and places and territories and landscapes around the world. And so the kind of radical, I think it's pretty radical, starting point for this is to actually, in throwing out the notion of the urban as unit, to also throw out the notion that there is an outside. And to pose the question as a theoretical, and also, as I'll explain, a political experiment. What happens if we internalize the non-urban into the heart of the theory of urbanization? So what would it look like to construct a theory of urbanization, and indeed a cartography of urbanization, without embracing the assumption that there's a non-urban that constitutively defines the boundaries of the urban? And that's the direction that we're moving in. So towards what I'm calling urban theory without an outside. So the question is, what is this U? What is urbanization? How can we define it without an outside? Can we define it without an outside? So this is a model that, for those of you who know the work of Henri Lefebvre, that he experimented with in his, I think, really provocative and as relevant as ever book, La Révolution Urbaine, The Urban Revolution, published in 1970. And so this was his model of the kind of evolution of urbanization. And he spoke of the move towards a critical zone, a critical point of implosion, explosion, in which urbanization would become generalized. And this is the terrain that I'm situating my work on, building on some of the frameworks that Lefebvre kind of elaborated. So a couple methodological starting points for this exercise, but before I tell you that, let me quickly hasten to clarify some things that I'm not saying when I say urban theory without an outside, generalized urbanization. So first of all, I'm not talking about the Death Star, okay? I'm not talking about a situation where the full planet is like a single metallic grid, no density gradient, you know, urban planet. So oftentimes when me or some of my colleagues who are writing about these things, we give a lecture, sometimes the image that is selected is like a Isaac Asimov transcore or a Death Star, which is not implausible. That's what, you know, the notion of planetary urbanization at first blush might seem to imply. But let me just say, like, if that's what your association is with generalized or planetary urbanization, no, that's not the argument. As I will explain, planetary urbanization is fundamentally a way of understanding spatial differentiation and polarization and territorial inequality. So it's a lens through which to think about differentiation of space, not homogenization, so including in terms of density and many other different indicators. So generalized urbanization is not the Isaac Asimov or Death Star scenario. And let me also underscore, this may already be obvious, but it needs to be underscored. Generalized or planetary urbanization is not a way of saying that we live in an urban age because more than 50% or some other percentage, 75% of the world's population lives within cities. I already obviously explained my criticisms of that, but this is a very different approach to understanding the generalization of urbanization. The claim about planetary urbanization that I'm going to be developing here is not simply, okay, most people live within cities, whatever you mean by cities. On the contrary, the theory of planetary urbanization that I'm going to develop has a lot to do with looking at the ways in which non-city landscapes are being operationalized in relation to the growth and expansion of cities. So that's what I'm going to develop. So let me lay out my methodological agendas. So number one, avoid the fetish of urban form. For me and Christian Schmidt, there is no single morphology of the urban. So whether it's the Burgess model of the concentric rings, whether it's the Gottman model of megalopolis or some other model, there are many, many different spatial conditions and arrangements that are associated with urbanization. We can't assume that there is a single morphology. So particularly in the design disciplines, we often equate particular processes with particular morphological expressions. I'm very interested in the morphological expressions, but I don't want to, on a definitional level, assume that some of those morphological expressions or conditions are more city-like or urban than others. I think we have to interrogate that. We have to analyze it as an empirical question. There might actually be a diversification of urban morphologies that have been produced and transformed throughout the history of capitalism. Secondly, urbanization for me is not just about city growth, but entails the production of operational landscapes to support city growth. So for the moment, by city growth, I just mean agglomeration and densification. Whether it's a city or something else needs to be specified. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the claim here is that urbanization is not just expressed in the dense zones of what we normally call cityness. Instead, it involves wide-ranging transformations of space and territory and landscape to facilitate that city growth. And we need to integrate an analysis of these operationalized or operational landscapes into our understanding of urbanization. And then finally, building on the previous two propositions, for me and for Christian Schmidt, urbanization involves both a moment of concentration and a moment of extension. So there's a dialectic here of concentrated urbanization and what we are calling extended urbanization. So I'm kind of trying to be a little bit playful here, since Kingsley Davis formalized his theory of urbanization in an algebraic formula of the U equals population of cities over the population of territories. I thought, okay, here's how we would formalize our particular theory. U, urbanization, equals concentrated urbanization. The double arrow is, of course, the universal signal or symbol for a dialectical relationship. And all that I'm saying here is that urbanization is a dialectic, mutual presupposition and yet mutual contradiction between the moment of concentration and the moment of extension. So let me develop this a little further. So concentrated urbanization is the moment of implosion. It has many morphological expressions: agglomeration, node, metropolis, and region. And extended urbanization is the moment of explosion, the production of operational landscapes that support and result from agglomeration. So I want to analyze these two moments as co-constitutive of the urban process, rather than doing, at least what I've been suggesting, most of the tradition of urban theory is doing, focusing just on the moment of concentration. So what happens to our understanding of urbanization if you bring these two things into a kind of fully dialectical relationship? So let me unpack each a little bit more. So concentrated urbanization, again, is the moment of concentration, centralization, densification. And it generally has, even though there are many morphologies associated with it, it involves some idea that there's a clustering together of people, of infrastructure, and investment within space. And for me, the paradigmatic theorist of this moment, at least in a capitalist context, is Friedrich Engels, writing about 19th century Manchester, where he talks about the way that the development of capitalism and the industrialization of capital in particular involves the clustering together of workers and infrastructure and capital within a big industrial city. So in some ways, that's a paradigmatic analysis of this moment of industrial urbanization, which enables us to understand some of the many different forms of concentrated urbanization from Engels' time all the way up to the kind of massive, large-scale urban industrialization of China that we're seeing in the early 21st century, and not only China. So this moment of concentration, even if it does involve densification, centralization, it takes many forms. So it could take the form of a kind of Chicago concentric ring model. It could take the form, which the concentric rings are obviously expanding outwards, so the agglomeration is never static. It's never just you draw the boundary, it's always moving outwards, expanding or frequently expanding. This is Doxiadis' map of London in the 19th and up through the 20th century. So the scale of agglomeration gets expanded and re-territorialized. So, but for me, this is still basically agglomeration. I wouldn't interpret this the way it's sometimes interpreted by urbanists and geographers as decentralization. It's just simply the rescaling of concentration onto a larger and larger territory. It's still basically an expression of this moment of concentrated urbanization. So this is Brian Barry's famous map of the commuting zones in the United States in the 1960s, which is also most frequently invoked as an illustration of decentralization. So showing that basically the commuter sheds of big US metropolitan regions are expanding further and further out. But for me, this is still basically a visualization of concentration. So because the idea is that even if more and more people are living further and further away from the city core, the diagram basically shows the way, and we'd have to update the diagram quite a bit today, but for the moment, the point is just that the diagram shows that the commuter sheds themselves are oriented towards movement into and out of a central city location during the course of the working day. And finally, this is the Pearl River Delta, oftentimes invoked as a model of a radically new urban form. In some ways, its morphology is quite obviously specific and in some ways unique and worthy of theorizing, but in the framework I'm laying out here, it still basically embodies the moment of concentration. It's concentration of infrastructure, population, and investment on a very, very large territorial scale. But for me, it's still basically the expression of this moment of concentrated urbanization. So back to extended urbanization, so it's not just the moment of concentration, but the construction of operational landscapes to support that moment of concentration. So in this definition, it's the uneven transformation of territory, place, and scale to facilitate the growth, thickening, and reorganization of this urban fabric of densification. Many different morphological forms, as I'm about to explain. If Engels is the kind of core theorist of concentrated urbanization, in some ways it's, I think, productive to think of Marx as a paradigmatic theorist of extended urbanization in a very important and kind of in recent years rediscovered section of Capital on what he calls ursprüngliche Akkumulation. It's often translated as primitive accumulation, but ursprüngliche really means original. It's kind of the Ursprung, the origin. So the original moment of accumulation in which he discusses the ways in which to produce a proletariat that's reliant upon the wage for its own social reproduction, you actually have to violently dispossess people from any access to the land through which they can engage in social reproduction outside of the wage relation. So basically, you enclose the land outside of the city in order to create a waged proletariat that then appears in Engels' book on the condition of the working class in England. So so the claim is basically a very spatial kind of argument that has a lot of implications for the questions we're discussing here. You've got to massively reorganize property relations, enclosing the common lands and expropriating the peasantry from access to agricultural land in order to facilitate the processes of urban industrialization that eventually are expressed in the form of the industrial city. So Marx is analyzing ursprüngliche or original accumulation with reference to the rise of capitalism, but several recent scholars, including actually David Harvey, have made the argument that this original moment of accumulation is actually an ongoing process. So he calls it accumulation by dispossession. So there's an ongoing dispossession of people from non-commodified forms of social reproduction that is a precondition for any form of capital accumulation, any form of capitalist development. Now, I want to use that kind of reference to accumulation by dispossession or original accumulation as a kind of foundation for developing a theory of extended urbanization, because it alludes us, it attunes us, it directs our attention to the ways in which the reorganization of, as it were, non-city landscapes is a precondition for the production of what we call the city. And the production of the city, in turn, transforms non-city landscapes. So this is precisely the dialectic that I described earlier as a dialectic between concentrated and extended urbanization. So just a couple of visualizations of this to give you an idea of what I have in mind. So this is a visualization of the coal mining zones in northern England and Wales in the late 19th century. So for me, these zones are as essential to the urbanization processes that Engels analyzed in Manchester and London in the mid-19th century as the so-called slums to which he directed his attention. Without these zones of, indeed, fossil fuel-based resource extraction, which encompass very large territories of both labor exploitation and environmental degradation, you cannot have the growth of the city that he and other urban theorists subsequently analyzed. So suddenly these become essential to the urban condition. To describe the urban condition, you've got to bring them in, even if they're not characterized by density, concentration, along the lines of traditional definitions of cityness. This is a map actually from Jean Gottman himself of the aqueducts and the broader water supply system of New York City in the mid-20th century. There's a very interesting literature in radical geography on the so-called new urban political ecology. Matthew Gandy and others have started to study this in very productive and interesting ways, looking at the geographies of water supply beyond the city, oftentimes at very, very large scales, sort of hydrological systems that facilitate and support urban life within the dense center. So they too become zones that are central to the problematique of the urban. This is a wonderful 19th century map by a statistical cartographer named Minard, who really amazing sort of cartographic innovation at his time. Before GIS or any such thing had ever been dreamt up, he had the idea that you could integrate quantitative spatial data into the production of an interesting and illuminating map. And as it turns out, a lot of his cartographic interventions in the 19th century have a lot to do with the problematique that we're calling extended urbanization. So this is a visualization of rail networks in Western Europe. And as you can see, the thickness of the line is intended to be an indicator of the density and amount of rail traffic. And it's a pretty fascinating window into that particular moment in the historical geography of European urbanization and also European empire, European colonialism. So you've got obviously the central hubs, above all London and Paris, which to and from which a huge amount of the rail traffic goes, and it's obviously mainly directed towards the main ports of Northern Europe, Southern England, and the Mediterranean, which are the key kind of nodes of connectivity within these rapidly expanding imperial systems. So extended urbanization forces us as a kind of lens into the urban condition, not only to consider the geographies of transport infrastructures, but more generally it opens up onto the broader geographies of colonialism and empire, which are deeply intertwined with processes of global urbanization during arguably the entire history of capitalism. And Minard's map, even though it's focused on a very specific indicator, it starts to provide a very interesting lens into those questions. This is a map of submarine cables, so infrastructures of connectivity, one among many ways in which we might start to think about the oceans as zones of urbanization. I could show, I didn't put them up in this presentation, but I could show you a map of late 19th century telegraph cables, which basically also go under the ocean in order to create kind of earlier moment of worldwide communications connectivity. So those relays of connectivity are essential to the everyday operations of major urban centers all over the world. It's clear that the point of kind of interface between these infrastructures and the consumers of the information are pretty much, you can see that quite well in this map, big cities. So it's another way in which we can think about the relationship between extended and concentrated urbanization. And then finally, back to my book cover. So now hopefully it's clear what I said at the outset of the presentation, maybe confusing, hopefully a little provocative, but given the framework that I've been introducing, hopefully it's now pretty clear why I think that this zone of the tar sands is a pretty important supporting operational landscape for urbanization processes. Let me just take a quick look at my clock. So, so the worldwide, the condition of planetary urbanization for me is as much about the growth of big cities, that remains fundamentally important for me, as it is about the operationalization of territory and landscape to support those big cities. And if I may, I think I've been going for about 50 minutes, and I don't know how you guys are doing here, but I'm wondering if you guys will permit me another 10 minutes, I'd like to just concretize this a little bit more and give you a sense of one of the speculative projects that we're developing in the Urban Theory Lab, just to give you a sense of kind of research horizons for this kind of meta theoretical critique. A bunch of people are nodding, so I'm gonna just look at you guys, the ones who are nodding, and take that as permission to continue. So thank you for that. But I will stop soon. So extreme territories of urbanization. So this opens up new questions about research, new questions about design intervention, and new political questions, I think, about global urbanization that can't be posed if you simply think about cityness and big agglomerations. So we decided to develop the ideas and see if these ideas about operational landscapes of extended urbanization made any sense by trying to apply them using some very difficult, we tried to apply them to basically the most difficult cases, the most difficult sites that we could find. So it would be plausible using this framework to go to, let's say, the Nile River Valley, the Ganges Plain, the Pearl River Delta, to choose some pretty large-scale zones of urbanization as important sites in which planetary urbanization is being consolidated. And that would be an extremely interesting and productive exercise, to do. But we decided to try to test these concepts, see if they have productive ramifications, doing something a bit trickier. So if you look at this iconic map of the nighttime lights, which is it's a very kind of hegemonic, in some ways quite ideological visualization of the global urban condition. It's also a data set, I think, as many of you know. Like, it's kind of like, I don't know, corn syrup. Like, you look at the ingredients in a lot of different foods, and there's corn syrup, or I don't know, some other kind of thing that's in there. It's in everything. It's a little bit like that with your GIS data. Like, the nighttime lights are often somewhere lurking in there as a kind of aspect of the data that you might not immediately see. So it's become an extremely interesting, very important visualization and data set for thinking about population distributions around the world. A lot could be said about the nighttime lights. We have a project going where we're actually looking at the kind of cultural use of the nighttime lights in contemporary kind of urban and design discourse. But for the moment, what I want to draw your attention to about the nighttime lights is that, so it looks like a photograph It's actually highly scrubbed and processed. You know, if you actually, before they processed it, the oceans are filled with nighttime lights because they're giant oil tankers crossing the oceans. So they scrub that out. You also, it's a little hard to see at this resolution, but North Dakota and a number of other zones in which there's fracking going on look like giant megalopolises because the fracking generates huge flares that generate nighttime lights. So there's a lot of light that they actually scrubbed out of this data set. So it's not a photograph, it's actually quite an abstraction. It's as abstract, I would argue, as the Minard map that I put up a few minutes ago. So this opens up some questions about visualization. But one thing that does seem clear about the nighttime lights is that even though it gives you a more fluid image of the urban spread of the world than, let's say, a kind of urban age model would, where it's just kind of cities that are bounded, there are still huge zones on this map that are basically, or at least appear, empty. They look empty, they look like they're outside of settlement, and therefore, if you view this as a proxy representation of the urban condition, you think that, okay, well, these empty zones are outside of urbanization. So in our work on the extreme territories of urbanization, we decided precisely to look at the zones that appear to be blank spaces on this particular map, and we call them the extreme territories of urbanization. So we're looking at, this is ongoing right now within the Urban Theory Lab, the Amazon, the Arctic, the Gobi Steppe, the Himalayas, the Sahara Desert, Siberia, the Pacific Ocean, the atmosphere itself, and we're contemplating looking at Patagonia, actually, which also on the nighttime lights map appears basically empty. And the idea was basically to put this theory that I spent the last 45 minutes laying out for you under extreme stress. The point of a theory is to open up new questions and new horizons for both thought and action. And so if this theory is intended to illuminate the kind of global urban condition, then it should be able to do that in relation to a variety of different conditions around the world. So we thought, okay, let's subject it to stress by trying to apply this approach to concentrated and extended urbanization to these extremely remote zones of the world and see if it actually helps us understand what's going on. So that's basically what we started doing in my lab. And if I can get this video to play, which I think it is, it's like a 5-minute video and it just quickly overviews, oops, what we did. Okay, no, it's going, okay. As long as we have volume. We need a little more volume. In the early 1970s, Henri Lefebvre anticipated a situation of generalized urbanization in which an urban fabric would be extended to encompass the entire planet. More recently, geographer Edward Soja declared that every square inch of the world is urbanized to some degree. While the changing morphology and scale of urbanized regions has attracted considerable attention among urban scholars, the worldwide urban fabric postulated by Lefebvre and Soja remains under-researched and poorly understood.
As shown in the iconic nighttime lights map, urbanization is most commonly represented as concentration, densification, and agglomeration. However, the Urban Theory Lab proposes a theoretical framework to understand these concentrated forms of urbanization in dialectical relation to the worldwide operational landscapes which support the worldwide urban network, and which together constitute the Lefebvrean urban fabric. Urbanization, therefore, must be understood as having both concentrated and extended dimensions.
Despite this new image of planetary urbanization, which includes both agglomerations and their operational landscapes, there are spaces which are commonly represented as untouched, empty, and not yet urbanized. Our task in this research project is to use our new approach to urban theory to explore whether the process of urbanization is also transforming the apparently most remote places of the planet. To what extent are processes of extended urbanization unfolding even in these extreme territories?
The analysis of the extreme territories explores the dynamics of this dialectical understanding of urbanization along several key axes. The intensity of commodification, expressed in the reorganization of land use and property relations, from resource extraction to environmental degradation. The extension and thickening of connectivity infrastructures, from roads, air routes, shipping lanes, and satellite orbits to submarine cables. The socio-metabolic transformations that result from new regimes of intensity and connectivity, generating diverse forms of environmental reorganization and degradation at every spatial scale, affecting the very foundations of human and non-human life.
Through this analysis, we can generate new understandings of the extreme territories as spaces of urbanization that avoid the fetish of urban form, supersede the urban-non-urban divide, historicize urbanization as a process that is inextricable from capitalist forms of industrialization.
In order to test this theoretical framework, we have developed a methodology to investigate the various extreme territories. Each team analyzed an extreme territory through 3 probes, focusing respectively on the issues of intensity, connectivity, and metabolism.
These probes were used to generate a synthetic map that summarized their findings.
Each team then drilled down into one specific process of transformation, such as agriculture, military operations, resource extraction, or environmental degradation.
Teams further articulated these global assemblages among 3 key dimensions of analysis. Global economy, with a timeline-based periodization of political economic restructuring. Agglomeration, exploring the links between extended and concentrated urbanization. Urban fabric, mapping territorial transformations at various spatial scales.
All these components help build a theory that can explore the dialectics between concentrated and extended urbanization, and on this basis illuminate the rapidly changing urban fabric of our planet. So, pretty speculative, pretty experimental. I know folks here will be, I assume folks here will be interested in the kind of visualization element. Chris and I were talking about this before the lecture tonight. The interplay between theoretical experimentation and visualization as a kind of experimental strategy for fine-tuning theory, while at the same time the ways in which existing visualizations, like the ones that I began with, presuppose theoretical assumptions that we need to move beyond. So in our lab, developing visualization has actually emerged as a key strategy for elaborating and also transforming some of our theoretical assumptions. So just to give you, this is all very much work in progress. We're continuing this year, but these are just some of the initial visualizations. Some of them were obviously in the video that have emerged on our different extreme territories, the Amazon, the Sahara. So you can see from these already, the zones are not empty at all. There's all kinds of land use intensification, there's infrastructures of transportation and communications, connectivity, and there's massive socio-metabolic environmental transformation that's directly tied in with urban development processes. So the vision from the nighttime lights is immediately, like this was one of the incredibly kind of really remarkable things that we found even within a few weeks of starting this project, is that nighttime lights vision is fully ideological. Because and not only for these reasons, for many other reasons too. I mean, they're zones that are mediated through dispossession, labor exploitation, and so forth. So the representation of them as if they were empty is actually misleading and dangerous in all kinds of ways. So that's one thing that comes through on these maps. This is the Himalayas, hydroelectric infrastructure. So the mountains become increasingly urbanized, alpine urbanization. This is the Arctic. A lot more could be said about the Arctic. There's obviously a lot of research being done about the Arctic, but it's clearly part of the world's urban fabric. In some ways, the oceans are a difficult case, but when you start to think about it, not so much. I mean, for me, the oceans are the same, increasingly, the same type of entity as, let's say, a highway corridor, like the 101 freeway. So it's obviously a different kind of produced infrastructure. It's a different kind of produced space, but it's used and mobilized in a way that's increasingly analogous to the way that we use highway infrastructures. It's just sort of large-scale shipping lanes. So again, that's a polemical statement, but it's intended to provoke thinking about non-terrestrial zones of urbanization. And the ocean, certainly the surface of the ocean, but also the depths of the ocean can be analyzed as a zone of urbanization. And finally, the atmosphere seems like a completely outrageous sort of zone to think about as a zone of urbanization, but as we developed this work, it became really quite plausible through the kind of analytic lens that we've been developing to think of it as a zone of urbanization. There are very specific zones of concentration, very specific types of infrastructure that are required in order to launch satellites into the atmosphere, and this is only just the beginning of what we've done, but the sort of geographies of space orbits, geostationary orbit is kind of like the central axis of the atmosphere's urban fabric, but also geographies of space junk and the different orbital geographies that are associated with all the geospatial technology that we have in our pocket phones and in our, all the machinery that we use, all the coordinating apparatus that we use in our everyday lives within big cities is increasingly interconnected with these kind of atmospheric zones. So it becomes quite clear that the atmosphere itself is quite essential as an operational landscape to global urbanization. And then we're developing these maps further, and so far we've only developed one kind of genuinely synthetic map of our extreme territories, and that's the Amazon. But this is the product of thousands of hours of work, actually, because it involves, I won't go into the details, but it's a kind of initial attempt to create, you saw from the visualizations I put up so far, they all use a different cartographic vocabulary. But for the eventual book that we want to produce, we'll try to develop a shared cartographic vocabulary for representing all of these different spaces in relation to some of our theoretical concerns. So this is just a first cut into the Amazon, which tries to synthesize a whole range of different forms of information on land use intensification, infrastructures of connectivity, and socio-metabolic transformation. So it's an ongoing project, and I think that maybe this would be a good moment for me to stop. I know that we hemorrhaged a few people during this discussion, but thanks to the rest of you for staying, and maybe if we have time, let's open it up for discussion. Thank you very much.